Oof. This one is a real doozy. Today, I'll be talking about The Undertaker's Daughter by John James Minster. Typically, when a book, movie, TV show, what have you, isn't my cup of tea, I try to keep my opinions to myself, or I focus on the positive. I always try to find something that someone might enjoy, even if I don't so much, in my reviews. I felt compelled, though, to post a full review of this book because I received a copy of the book from the publisher in exchange for a review. And I've been seeing reviews pop up on Bookstagram, on BookTube, so I know I'm not the only one out there. I'm also not the only one out there who feels the way I feel. Now, I have a strong-ish stomach. I'm not a total gorehound. You know, when the torture porn craze happened, I wasn't really riding that wave, but I can generally stomach some blood here or there. I do love a slasher movie, for example. Getting into more extreme horror and splatterpunk isn't necessarily my thing, but I'll give it a try. When I started seeing reviews of this book and they were talking about how disgusting it is, how bad it gets, how many trigger warnings there should be, I didn't understand what was going on because I was well into the first half of the book and I just wasn't seeing it. However, I hit page 88 and that is where I had to stop reading. Let's talk about why. Yes, you heard that correctly. I had to stop reading this book. I'm generally not a quitter when it comes to my books. I like to see the action through. I like to see what happens to the characters. I always want to find some kind of redeeming quality, and I don't like to give up that initial investment, if you will, but I just couldn't do it. Let's kick things off by describing the plot. I do want to be fair and talk about the portion that I read. I recognize that some people out there may enjoy the book, they may keep reading, they may power through. Some people like kind of gross out details just for the fun of being grossed out. So we'll get into all that, but let's kick things off by just describing the general plot. We're introduced to our main character, Anna Dingle, and her best friend, Naomi, and a few other characters who are sort of rotating from the very start. We have rotating points of view. That keeps things interesting. It can be a bit confusing at first, but it's exciting to get to know new characters and to see how they'll all fit together and how their lives mesh. What is the connection that they have? So Anna is the titular Undertaker's daughter. I found the initial description of Anna to be very intriguing. You know, this is not technically a young adult book, but it has a very young adult feel, especially because it focuses on high schoolers. And so I thought that could be really interesting ground to explore, being a teenage Undertaker's daughter. You know, it's like the Fear Streets and the Chris Pines that we're familiar with, but this one is going to go a bit deeper and be a bit more aggressive. Based on the title, we know that most of the action will center on Anna, and from chapter to chapter, we sort of funnel in on her to focus more on her. And at least the first half of the book that I was able to get through, we see Anna undergo a kind of transformation. She has a very strict evangelical mother who doesn't want her wearing makeup or dressing for the boys, if you will. And that is all sort of juxtaposed against Anna's relationship with her best friend Naomi, who comes from, I would say, a more liberal Jewish background. Naomi is also obsessed with any kind of Jewish lore, Jewish mythology. There have been some tablets that were discovered, and you can tell from the get-go that something is going to happen with this mythology Anna being bullied because she is plain and she's not allowed to dress up and explore some more secular interests. At least the first half of the book sort of comes to a head when Anna defies the wishes of her mother and goes to a rock concert where the object of her affection is performing. I won't go into a whole lot more detail just yet. Hold that thought. But that's a pretty much where you get by mid book. The supernatural element still hasn't fully formed, at least at this point where I had to stop reading. Let's talk about the author himself next. You know, people say write what you know, and that is something that this author in particular does well. I was fascinated from the get-go by the description of mortuary science and common practices. It's morbid, but it's interesting. If you are a fan of YouTube channels like Ask a Mortician, then you will also find that aspect very engaging. I think the author also knows religion very well. There was quite a bit of exposition on Judeo Christian beginnings, if you will, and Kabbalah and all of these things you can tell are heading somewhere. I will say that there are reviews online that comment on dialogue being a bit heavy on the religious side, that it comes across as more of a religious textbook. There are long chunks of exposition where this character, as I mentioned, Naomi, who's obsessed with the mystery of some tablets that were discovered, describing the discovery to her boyfriend, and he answers in weirdly sexual ways. So there's that. The characters themselves, going on a little bit of a deeper dive there, I got Napoleon Dynamite vibes as I was reading. And by that, I mean that I can tell the action is set now in contemporary times because there are references to Instagram, to tablet devices, but there's sort of a timeless feel. The characters have names like Tammy and Sue, so I don't know if that was intentional, that there was sort of a throwback feel there. I almost wanted the characters to be more college age because for 17-year-olds, I just thought the way that they interacted didn't ring necessarily true for me. Again, the teens are obsessed with archaeology. They use vocabulary words like contrapositive. But, you know, I could see that being sort of a Kevin Williamson thing, too. The dialogue for his movies, for Dawson's Creek, was kind of meta and intentionally highbrow because it's sort of funny coming from a teenage cast of characters, I guess. Consistency among characters was a bit of an issue as well. Their name spellings changed sometimes from instance to instance, so I found myself having to go back and think, wait a minute, was that the same person? Yeah, okay, it was. The characters are not terribly likable. That's not always a bad thing. I actually love unlikable protagonists. Think Flannery O'Connor, think Shirley Jackson. Most of their characters are incredibly flawed, and it actually makes the narrative all the more interesting. But there were just strange details that were shared from the point of view of the characters that I didn't find endearing. I didn't necessarily see the characters as being stereotypical because it's not necessarily stereotypical to have a teen character who's obsessed with archaeology or who acts as a bodyguard for the popular girl. There were some promising elements there, but what I mean by unlikable or not endearing was there were just some details that I felt were odd to include. I remember a throwaway comment about someone buying their boots from an illegal Mexican immigrant, and it was written in a way so that I kind of considered it as a specific character's way of describing the boots. I don't know if I'm explaining myself well. It just seemed like a throwaway detail that was bizarre and made the character unlikable and discriminatory for no real reason. Does that make sense? I understand that characters can be flawed, characters can be biased or prejudiced, but it just seemed like a random throwaway detail that had no bearing later down the road. or on the character of the character. Let's talk about the action. I can see how a reader would view this work as campy or contrived. Let me say, and or contrived. The way that events are set into motion is just a little too perfect, if you know what I mean. Plot devices like one character in particular's assault are used to keep the plot going, and they're sort of just glossed over. There's quite a bit of suspension of disbelief required. Anna, remember our main character, is a minor who is sent to pick up the body of an executed inmate the day after Anna was assaulted in a bar fight. She's 17, alone. And I use the word assaulted. I don't want to make light of anything here, but the way that the assault is described is sort of ambiguous, thankfully. But there's more information and there are more details revealed in a subsequent conversation. But in that conversation, even Anna goes back to talking about how hot she feels after her makeover. So that juxtaposition there was difficult for me, and I imagine that it would be for other readers. Up until about the halfway point, I was really reading this through a campy lens. I could see this being turned into a limited series like Midnight Club. I'm not a huge Chris Pine fan, and I say that because I just haven't read as much of his stuff. I was always more of an R.L. Stine kind of kid, but I think what they did with Midnight Club was really interesting because I read so many reviews of people saying, I wasn't a huge fan of the books, but I think they really took the plot and did something incredible with it. They took it to the next level. When you think back to 70s and 80s exploitation movies, even like Savage Streets, I was thinking maybe that's the vibe that we're going for here. So I tried to keep going and I tried to power through, because even the religious angle is one that I felt set this premise apart. Reading reviews online, there is more Jewish mythology that comes in, and that's where the supernatural element has its foundation. So it's a shame that I just couldn't get there. My verdict is that elements are definitely polarizing here. Again, I made it to page 88, and I'm realizing I still haven't explicitly said what happens on page 88, so I might just be hyping it up in your imaginations. You might go check it out to find out what happens on page 88, but just suffice it to say that there's a very unexpected scene involving a mortuary student and a corpse that I could not get past. It was totally unexpected. Again, reading other people's reviews to gauge my reaction. Am I overreacting? Should I keep going? It's one of those things that it just happens, and there's no real bearing on the plot. It's just a gross out one-off scene, and it just got to be a bit too much for me. I couldn't see myself getting through the rest, because from there on out, apparently that's where things go. Again, I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not much of an extreme horror, splatterpunk kind of guy, and so I just realized I think it's not for me, but I needed to post a review anyway. See what you all think, if you've checked out this book yet, if you plan to perhaps have a conversation on the subgenre of gross out horror in and of itself. I'd like to know what you think. I hope I haven't been too negative. I don't want to be hard on any other author, because I know how it feels to pour your ideas into something and put it out there for the masses. So please, I don't want any offense to be taken here, because it's not intended, but not everybody's work is for everybody. And even as a writer myself, I get that. So I hope that's understood. Anyway, let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Until next time, this has been Derek D.C. Phillips, bringing you all things frightful.